Well, hello, Big Chillians. This week it's me doing the introduction instead of Frank, and unfortunately we can't be joined by Samuel Jones either. But we do have the pleasure of being joined by Derek Ray, who is currently the ESPN's lead Bundesliga commentator, as well as a contributor to ESPN FC and a columnist for ESPN.com, and whose voice may be most familiar to many of our listeners or viewers from his work with the FIFA video game series. So, Derek, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to be on with you both.
And Frank, hello to you as well. Sorry that I had to steal your thunder a little bit and do the introduction this time.
No, it's fine. I not too concerned. I'm actually more concerned for Derek that he has such an amazing career, and you just say that people are going to know him from FIFA and not from the 20 plus years of announcing he's done throughout his career.
I wouldn't worry about that, honestly, because it's actually true. I think for younger people who obviously play video games a lot, then that is probably who I am to a lot of younger people, not so much the guy who's been commentating since 1986 professionally, but the voice they hear on FIFA. So yeah, it's all fine.
that might actually be, I think we've got quite a few topics to cover, but let's get started, because one of the most interesting things sort of read about you in preparing for this was the way you sort of got your break into commentary, which I think is probably one of the more unusual stories. If you could just tell our listeners a little bit sort of how it came about and how you actually finally got the chance to sort of commentate on a match.
Well, I was very lucky, I have to say that. I was extremely fortunate at the age of 19 to get my big break. And I always say to young aspiring broadcasters, you do need to be lucky. You need to get that big break somewhere, and somebody has got to want to give you that break. So how do you put yourself in the position to get the big break? Because it's not just going to happen, to a random person on the street. It's going to be because you have some sort of body of work. Now, from a very young age, and I mean from the age of 7 in Aberdeen, where I'm from, northeast of Scotland, I had been very much into putting my voice on tape. And in 1974, when I was 7, we purchased our very first stereo cassette recorder. And young people always sort of, furrow their brow and go, what on earth is a stereo cassette recorder? Sounds like something from a different age. Well, of course it was, but it was the first time that in our household we had the chance to record ourselves, and it was quite a concept to a 7-year-old playing around with this device. And this was during the World Cup in 1974 in West Germany. And I've still got the tapes of me basically impersonating the commentators and the pundits that I heard on BBC and ITV at the time. But from that point on, I sort of then gravitated to a portable version of the same thing. And I would carry it around, in the park, on the street, at school. And I would just commentate on games. There'd be these impromptu games happening, and I would just commentate on them, just, for a laugh, really. But I realized I really enjoyed doing this. And when I was around 11, 12, I started taking the tape machine to Pittodrie Stadium, the home of my local club, Aberdeen, initially for reserve team games, but then plucked up the courage to do it for first team matches, with the crowd all around me and everything. And of course, I'd get the strangest looks you could imagine. People saying, who is that strange laddie who's talking to himself into a tape recorder the whole game? That's a bit strange, isn't it? That's a bit odd. But I kept these tapes, and my great hero was a guy called David Francie, who was the voice of Scottish football on radio at the time, on BBC Radio in Scotland, and had a very distinctive delivery. You definitely couldn't miss David Francie. Similar to other sports around the world, people have voices who they associate with particular teams or particular eras in sports that they follow. And so on a whim one day, I said, I'm going to write to David Francie, and I'm going to send him a tape of my work. And of course, my voice at that point hadn't broken, but I was commentating, and thought, well, I'll probably never hear back from him. Maybe it won't even reach him, but I'll try. Lo and behold, a few weeks later, this beautiful handcrafted letter came in from Newton Mearns in Glasgow. David Francie was the person who had responded to me that day. And he was very encouraging, said he enjoyed listening to my tape, gave me some tricks of the trades, things that I could be doing to improve. And he said, just keep in touch. So we sort of did over a number of years. And one of his suggestions had been to go and volunteer for hospital radio, which is something that exists in the UK to this day. And it's essentially a service for patients in hospital. You know, imagine if you're in hospital, you might want a radio service that's dedicated to your situation and your environment. And in those days, there wasn't really commercial radio in Aberdeen, where I was from, didn't really exist. So I basically signed up to do that, and it meant commentating on games, this time for a hospital audience from Pataudry. So what I'm really getting at is all the while I was having this practical experience of being a commentator on an amateur basis, so that when the time came, when I was 19, I was at university in Aberdeen, and I sent a tape again to David Francie, this time, and it tells you everything about the man. Instead of just writing back to me, and he didn't tell me about this, he just gave it to his bosses at the BBC. He said, have a listen to this. So they had a listen to it. And then a couple of weeks later, I got a letter from his boss at the BBC saying, we love what's on this tape. Could you come down to Glasgow sometime and have a chat about it? So I did. And to cut a long story short, I was given my big chance in April 1986 at the age of 19. And it was because the aforementioned Mr. Francie had picked up a knee injury and he couldn't do the game he was scheduled to do. So it was Kilmarnock against Dumbarton, which was the live game. So I went down to Glasgow. Was I nervous? I don't know. I suppose I was, but I don't remember being especially nervous. And maybe it was partially because I'd been doing it on an amateur basis for a while. So again, what I'm saying is it wasn't as though I was just sort of thrown in to do a commentary, having never, been behind the microphone before. I'd actually been doing it for quite some time, obviously not with the pressure of a live professional broadcast, but with the same discipline. So I did the game. I thought it went well. Got back to Aberdeen, taking the train, and there was a message when I got back saying, could you call Charles Runcie at the BBC? So I called Charles Runcie at the BBC, and he said, just to go over everything, we're thrilled, great today, really enjoyed it, but we want to know, are you ready for assignment number 2? I said, oh, is there a second assignment? I said, what's the second assignment? He said, well, he said, he said, listen to this. He goes, England against Scotland is coming up this midweek. As you know, we would like you to go to Wembley and be our commentator for that game. And that was purely, again, because they knew that David wasn't going to make it and they needed a replacement. And so, I had no idea that was part of the plan. That was my second game on air. I'd never been to Wembley. I'd never covered the oldest international fixture that there is. But here I was being given this chance for my second game. So it's a long-winded answer, but I think it maybe is necessary to give you the kind of the context behind how I got my break. And, touch wood, I've been doing that job since 1986, and I still love it just as much as ever.
No, I mean, it's a really fascinating story. And I guess it is good to balance the idea that it was a mixture of luck and preparation. And it wasn't just that, because I guess you could have kind of read the story as if, well, the commentator was injured and they plucked someone from the sort of crowd and then, never looked back from there. So no, it's good to see that it wasn't just sort of pure chance that.
But and that's absolutely right. What I would say though is, there are so many talented people in all walks of life who don't get that chance, and sometimes it just comes down to circumstances. I remember the big boss at BBC Scotland doing an interview about my story that month, and he said, yeah, it's a little bit like the in a musical, it's a bit like the lead voice in the musical has to pull out and you take somebody from the chorus line and they then become the lead voice. He goes, the difference with Derek is that he wasn't even close to the chorus line a week ago, So yeah, it's not lost on me how lucky I was to get that big break. But I've always said, and I say this to young broadcasters, you have to be ready to walk through that door when that big break comes, because you never know when it's going to arrive.
Yeah, no, that's obviously good advice. It's one of those things we've always tried to speak whenever we've interviewed people to try and see what kind of career advice they could give to people trying to break into their industry. So I think that is good, little bit of inspiration from people and also just encouragement to be perseverant. I guess the interesting thing also from your career, you've also then had quite an unusual career path in the sense that you've worked with a number of different broadcasters and covered a number of different leagues and sort of moved around quite a bit. how did you decide, sort of how did you end up moving? So for example, you moved to the US, my understanding is specifically for the 1994 FIFA World Cup. So how did you make that decision to sort of go there? Was it tactical in the sense that you thought that the sort of sport was going to explode in the United States, or was that kind of more by chance?
It was sort of more by chance. I mean, what I will say is if I try to analyze my personality, I'm a little bit restless at times. I think I'm the sort of person, and I see this with quite a lot of people in creative professions. I think I get to the point where once I've done a project for a few years, once I've been really immersed in it and put my heart and soul into it, I sort of look for something else to focus my energies on. And again, I think being young at the time, I think when you're young, you are especially restless. And, remember, I joined the BBC at 19. I was there for 5 years. I got to travel to 19 different countries to broadcast the game that I love, to do what I love. And a lot of people thought I was crazy when I said, you know what, I think it's time to try something else. And they said, but you've got the greatest job in the world. Why would you want to swap that for anything? And I think in my mind, I just thought, well, I've done this and maybe I'll come back to it again, but I'm ready for whatever the next chapter is. And I'd been intrigued by the USA for a while. I had started to read a lot more about the US. I'd first traveled to the US in the late 80s and just found that it was everything that I actually hadn't imagined that it was. When I was younger, I was very Eurocentric and I was sort of obsessed with every European country. I'm a fluent German speaker. Germany was the country I sort of looked to as the one that possibly I would end up living in long term. But the US had come later, and on my trips to the US, when I had free time, I had just found that it was a different sort of place with its own spirit. And of course, it wasn't lost on me that the World Cup was coming to the USA in 1994. Now, in 1990, at the World Cup in Italy, I had made contact with a few of the people who were to be running the World Cup in 1994. So I gave up this job with the BBC. I traveled to Boston, which was the city that had spoken to me most of the places that I had visited in the USA. I can't really tell you why, other than it just felt a little bit like home when I first arrived in Boston. And I decided I was going to set up shop in Boston as a freelance journalist. But I did something else that, again, a lot of people thought, you're not doing this, but it actually was a very good decision. I enrolled at a local college in Boston studying broadcasting, and people said, hang on, but you've spent 5 years with the BBC. I was lucky enough to win an award, the British Sports Broadcaster of the Year award in 1987 when I was at the BBC. They said people who win awards like that don't go to a sort of a starter college to learn broadcasting. And I said, well, first of all, I said, I'm not as arrogant as to think that I can never learn. And secondly, I'm going to a new culture, so I actually want to understand this culture more. And I thought, where better to do that than to sort of go to shop floor level, if you like, and understand the broadcasting culture in the USA. I'm really glad I did, because it is a different broadcasting culture. And I think I got to understand the USA a lot better through that time, just a few months, but getting to know, even little things like what the FCC is and, what the rules are around broadcasting and what the styles are around broadcasting in the USA. But concurrent with that, I was also making contacts. And that was really the point of coming to Boston, was to make contacts. And I did so, again, on a more intimate basis with the people who were running the World Cup in Boston, part of the bigger organizing committee, but the Boston venue. And the long and the short of it is that I was offered a job to actually move away from full-time broadcasting for a while. But again, it was still sort of broadcasting, certainly communications. So the job was press officer for the World Cup in the Boston venue as part of the bigger organizing committee. And my goodness, what a job that was, and what a great time that was. And I look back so fondly. The people I worked with were terrific. It was very much a kind of a crew with a global bent, if you like, which you would probably think makes sense with people who are working in international soccer, international football. And again, I got to make terrific contacts, even at sort of team and association level. You know, when you're a broadcaster or a journalist, you're covering events, you have a sort of a distant relationship with some of the actors in the drama, the players and the coaches. But when you're working for the organizing committee, you have access to the inner sanctum. You know, you are sort of part of the inner sanctum. So I got to live that for 2 years. I got to drive coaches of various teams around the Boston area as they looked for training sites. And you get to know people on a different basis during that. So that was really where it started. I didn't know where that was going to end. I just knew I wanted a new experience in the USA. I wanted to live it. I wanted to see if I liked it, you know, because there were no guarantees. And yeah, there were moments actually early on when I moved to Boston where I thought, no, I don't know. I don't know if this is for me. You know, I miss a little bit what I was doing back home. But I thought, no, stay the course. Stay this whole course, because you've chosen this for a reason. And you'll only know at the end of the course if it is for you. So I did that obviously through the World Cup in '94. And here's the funny thing. About 3 months before that World Cup, I got a call from one of the senior producers at ESPN, because I'd actually sent them a tape of my work a couple of years prior. The call basically was, oh yeah, we've got this tape of your work. We'd really love it if you would do a few of our World Cup games for us on ESPN. And of course I had to say, oh, I would love to, but of course I can't, because I'm the press officer here in Boston, and I can't give up this job, you know, so close to the tournament. I don't want to give up the job. I put so much into it. But that was a real hammer blow, if you like. But there's a lesson there too, because as a broadcaster, especially as a freelance broadcaster, which I've been for a big chunk of my career, there are times where you simply can't be in two places at once, and you have to make decisions about what you want to do and you know, what you should do based on where you are at that point in your life. But fortunately, the ESPN connection was to be revisited after the World Cup, and they came back and said, we're starting an international service. We've actually just started it. We'd love you to be part of that as a commentator. We've got rights to leagues all around the world, Brazil, the Netherlands, the Champions League coming up. And that was to sort of be a big part of my broadcasting identity in the US after 1994. But I'll certainly never forget the fabulous experience of working as part of the organizing committee in 94 at the World Cup.
Oh, that's very interesting. Again, very interesting. You touched on a point there. You talked about enrolling in broadcasting school in the US and sort of having to learn about the different culture and stuff. And I know that since working for ESPN and you've gone back to the UK to work for BT Sport and some other roles subsequently. Do you find that you have to change your style and your cadence depending on whether you're broadcasting for a sort of an American audience or a British audience? Or do you now feel just comfortable that you are who you are and the style is the same no matter what?
I would say at first I did. In the 90s, I did. I made a conscious effort to change quite a few things, because, quite frankly, it was put to me by a producer early on that they didn't want the British sound. That was not going to be welcome in the USA. It's funny how that has sort of come full circle. That's changed a lot in the modern era. But in the 90s, again, think about the context. We were at a time where, you know, the US maybe wasn't as open to the world back then. The game was seen as this sort of foreign game, and they wanted to Americanize it. You know, that was something that was crystal clear. So I think I did that a lot more in the early days. But I remember hitting a point towards the end of the 90s where I thought, this is not the way to do it, because I'm compromising who I really am here, you know? And so nowadays, I don't really give it much thought. I think maybe subconsciously I do. You know, if I'm talking just to a US audience, then, you know, my references might occasionally be more American in terms of if there's an American connection with the game, I might make that American connection. But I think ultimately, as a commentator, we shouldn't overthink that too much. You know, I think calling a sport is calling a sport, and we do it, you know, using the same techniques, irrespective of whether we're talking to the US or the UK. Of course, a lot of my work is for what we call international feeds, world feeds, and they are designed to be feeds that are applicable to the whole world. So I think that's quite a good discipline, because you learn when you do a world feed, you learn to try to talk to as wide an audience as possible at one time. But to go back to your question, yeah, I think in the early days, like a lot of people who were trying to make their way in the USA, that is what we were being fed, was that, tone down the Scottishness or the Britishness, if you can. But thankfully, I sort of made an executive decision to not do that, and I think it has served me well.
Yeah, that's great. And then so kind of going with that, you said that, back then the US kind of had that perception of the rest of the world. And what about the perception of football in the United States? Do you think that's changed a lot from when you started in the 90s to today? About like, people in the US, how they think football is played, and how much I think like love they now have for the game as opposed to in the 90s. Do you think that's changed a lot?
Oh yeah, massively. When I think back to the challenges we had in 1994, ahead of the 1994 World Cup, we were trying to basically educate a whole, mass of people as to what this was, and that really started, from my point of view, with local media in Boston, and some of the conversations I had with journalists, not so much journalists, but more editors and decision makers at local TV stations. They were not the easiest, because there was a real hostility. I would use that word. There was hostility to it, because this was sort of something they didn't really like the idea of. It's like, what is this? Who are these? Who's this guy who's coming in from another country trying to tell us about sports? We know all about sports here. We know about the Red Sox, and we know about the Patriots, and we know about the Bruins and the Celtics and all that kind of stuff. So you were dealing with that kind of cultural conundrum, if you like. And, think about where we are now, where the sport is much more entrenched, not obviously to the extent that the traditional American sports are, but it's just a totally different landscape. And I mean, back then, one of the things we had to face all the time was I'd pick up the Boston Globe, and there was a certain columnist. I won't name him because I don't want to give him the oxygen of publicity. He's still around. But there was a columnist who seemed to take great pleasure in just writing a hit piece almost every 2 weeks on how terrible the sport was, about how awful it was and how boring it was, and how the fact it was an international sport, made it somehow irrelevant to people in Boston. I mean, it bordered on, I would say it bordered on racist, a lot of what was written back then. In fact, there were some pieces that were outright racist. So that's what we were dealing with. We were dealing with a lot of ignorance and a lot of hostility. But I also realized that there were a lot of people out there who were very open to it and liked the differences and liked the fact that this was new, and their kids played it. And, maybe they had a friend from Portugal who had told them how great it was and they wanted to experience it. Maybe they had been to England or Germany once, or Italy, and had got a taste of it and had thought, wow, this is really something cool that's coming to our area. But nowadays, as I say, it keeps, with each sort of passing big tournament, I think it gets bigger and bigger in American terms. And so I think the World Cup obviously has had an impact there, especially, I would say, from around 2006 on. I think it really has grown and grown. And of course, you have more coverage of it on TV, or nowadays on streaming as well. It's available to more people. So I think it just stands to reason that on all levels now, the generation of today in the USA is far more educated about the sport and far more open to it. Back then, we did have quite a few hurdles we had to clear.
And when you're talking about a kind of a more educated audience, has that also changed the way that you broadcast in a way? Because now maybe you don't feel as if you're having to introduce the sport to viewers, but you're actually talking to people who have a high level of understanding and maybe a deep knowledge about the league and the sport?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is true. I'm not sure that I ever really made it sort of my mission to explain in sort of, blatant terms. What I would say is that I've always been a fan of the idea that intelligent commentary in of itself is explanatory, so that I've never really liked the idea of, and I know some commentators did this in the 90s in the US. I would hear them, they would explain what a free kick was, or explain what a corner was. I've always sort of said, if you just commentate, then people will pick it up. And the reason why I felt that way was I took an interest in American football and the NFL in the late 80s. but I didn't read a book, or I didn't need a commentator to tell me, yeah, well, it's first down, and that means they've got to go 10 yards, so they've got 3 downs to get. I just basically listened to the coverage on, that was available through CBS, NBC, ABC, etc. at the time, and I picked it up, and I thought, well, if I can pick that up, it's quite a different sport in comparison with the ones that I grew up with. If I can pick that up just by listening to the commentators, then surely, the American equivalent, somebody who's not been exposed to my sport, just by listening, if I explain it properly without over explaining it, then they'll get it. And I think that's where we are with the sport in the US now. I don't think people would want us to go over the top with that. And as a result, I really don't think there is any difference in the commentary styles nowadays. I think American commentators, as a rule, at least commentators who've grown up in the American culture, they tend to talk a little bit more, I would say, than European commentators. There's sort of an idea that you have to engage your audience by talking. I think in Europe, we feel a bit more, especially when you have crowds. Obviously, we don't have crowds at the moment in a pandemic. I think we feel a bit more that it's okay to let things sort of drift for 15, 20 seconds at a time and just let the crowd do the talking and then come back in. So there are differences that way. Also, when we talk about that kind of thing, American commentators have a technique they use where they like to say nothing over a goal. They like to talk quite a lot in the run of play, but then if there's a goal or a big moment, they say nothing for 30 or 40 seconds. Again, that's not really a European technique. There are differences. There are always going to be differences in how people view the job. But I think fundamentally, if your commentary is intelligent and on point, people will get it without you having to over egg the pudding, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think you probably touched on a few just cultural differences that extend beyond just commentary there in Americans and British people.
I was going to say, living in both the States and in Europe, what you said now just seems so blatantly obvious, like listening to the both different commentaries, and it's exactly how you describe it. It's so funny.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's just, again, it's cultural, isn't it? And it's what you grow up with, and it's what you think is, and you feel is right. And a lot of, commentary is feel. Yes, it's technique, but it's feeling the moment, and we all feel the moment in a different way. I mean, if you were to listen to, commentators from Argentina or Brazil, they feel the moment by going really loud and doing their exaggerated goal shout. In my culture, that wouldn't be as welcome. People would think that was overdoing it. Obviously, in the US, people feel that way too, because they like, or at least producers like, the silence from the commentator and just shots of the crowd and people getting excited. As I say, I tend to like to find, if I can, a memorable line, that occurs to me at the time to sum up the moment, and then say not much apart from that. So yeah, we all do it differently, but I think our upbringing is at the heart of why we perhaps do it differently in each country.
You talk there about trying to have a memorable line to sum up the moment. Do you ever find yourself trying to prepare sort of possible lines? If you go into a match thinking this might be the storyline, you never sort of prepare anything in advance?
No, not like that. And I don't know many commentators who actually do it that way. I think what you do is you prepare for a game, and in the process of preparing for a game, little themes come into your head, sometimes imperceptibly. Sometimes you don't even know that the theme is in your head, but remember, you're working sometimes 4 or 5 days ahead of the game, nonstop, just on that game. So things are sticking in your brain. And I find that is the best way. The best lines are ones that are completely unscripted. They just come to you in the moment. But because there is so much info in your brain at that particular moment, and you undoubtedly are thinking about what a player might do in a game, that something that you researched earlier in the week is going to stick. But no, I stop short of that, because I think if you over prepare that, then it is going to sound over prepared. It's going to sound out of context. And, I mean, there are times when you sort of do it without even knowing that you've done it. I remember a game in Scotland a few years ago, which was a really big game between Hearts and Hibs. And Hearts, 2 Edinburgh clubs, I should explain for people who don't know. Hearts were about to get relegated, and it looked as though they were going to be relegated by Hibs at Hearts' own ground, which would have been just the ultimate ignominy. And I remember at halftime saying to Gary McAllister, my co-commentator, saying, Hearts are really Hearts are really playing well here, and it's almost as though they're saying, not today, not here. And I said it at halftime off air, and then Hearts basically settled the issue near the end of the game with a goal from a guy called Billy King, and the scenes were just incredible, magical. You didn't have to be a Hearts fan. You could look at the scenes now and you'd think, wow, that is real football emotion. This was because a team wasn't avoiding relegation, but avoiding relegation that day at the hands of their great rivals. Just imagine how much that would hurt. And the line that I used on the air was, and it was not something I'd written down or prepared, apart from obviously in my mind, I'd prepared it with my halftime chat with my co-com Gary, was not on this patch of Edinburgh land, not in a derby, no relegation today. And I said it more forcefully than I've just said it to you now. But Hearts fans have told me they have that on their ringtone. Some of them have that on their ringtone. They when they contact me, they sometimes preface it with that line because it means an awful lot to them. That kind of thing means a lot to a football fan. And again, it was one that I didn't think about because I didn't know how the game was going to go, but I had said it to Gary at halftime, and obviously it planted a seed in my mind. And that's usually where the best lines come from.
That's interesting. And I guess from a commentator's perspective, right? Sometimes your career can be a bit defined, not by a memorable line. So, you have the kind of Martin Tyler's Aguero City QPR moment. If you look back on your career so far, and maybe there will be bigger moments to come and more defining lines, is that moment the one that sticks out to you the most, or is there another sort of individual match moment and something that you've said that you think?
It's a funny one because I don't think too much about that. I guess I probably maybe only think about it in the context of really big games that have had dramatic endings. And, sometimes, to be honest, simple is best. That's the one thing that I think as commentators forget. I think sometimes we think we have to be more intricate than is absolutely necessary. Some of the best lines are simple lines. And one of the biggest games, in fact, I would probably say the biggest story that I've ever covered in the context of a big final would have been 2005 in Istanbul, when Liverpool came back from 3-0 down to take Milan, then for me the best team in Europe, to penalties, and Liverpool won it on penalties. And I hadn't watched that back for a long time because all the years I've been working in the UK, I'd had the DVD in my cabinet here in Boston, and somebody wanted me to listen back to it for a project they were doing. So I did. And I listened back to the very end of it. And if you remember, so it was Shevchenko who was denied by Jerzy Dudek, the Liverpool goalkeeper, who was the hero in the penalty shootout. And the line was simple, but I remember listening back thinking that actually fits. I'm so happy to hear that back because I haven't heard it for a long time. And sometimes with the passage of time, things don't suit your ears as much. You think, oh, I could have said that better. But it was fairly simple. It was I think I said Shevchenko. I said saved by Dudek, and I said against all odds, against all the odds, against all expectations. And then there was surprise in my voice. Liverpool are the champions of Europe. And I sort of said it with almost a kind of a, can you believe that this has actually happened? And so that kind of line I'm always happy with because it wasn't overdone. It wasn't contrived. It was just reacting to what I saw in front of me. Similarly, my favorite derby in the world is the Borussia Dortmund Schalke derby in Germany. And I've been lucky enough to be on site for quite a few of them. And one of the greatest of all time was fairly recently in November 2017. And I was there with Stefan Freund doing it. And it was 4-0 to Dortmund at halftime. And, we're thinking, my goodness, this is going to be, 6 or 7-0. But Schalke started eating into their lead in the second half. They got to 4-1, 4-2, 4-3 near the end of the game. We're thinking, could this happen? Well, it did happen deep in stoppage time. They made it 4-4. And, so Naldo, who scored the goal, the Brazilian, and I remember to this day, can see him jumping into the heavens, heading it home. And all I said was Naldo, and then I said, this is why they call it the mother of all derbies. That's all you need, And I hadn't prepared it. It just, obviously that is what that it is referred to as Die Mutter aller Derbys in German, the mother of all derbies. So sometimes when you hear a clip extolling the virtues of that derby, you'll hear my voice with that line. This is why they call it the mother of all derbies. So, yeah, I think you go with the feel, you go with the emotion, and hopefully, as a commentator, you have enough words in your head to make it sing and to make it fit.
Again, really interesting answer. And over the course of that answer, you've already mentioned the fact that you're fluent in German, and obviously your pronunciation of certain words there kind of shows that. That's another topic I kind of wanted to ask you about. One, I suppose, how did you become fluent? Sort of, was that because you wanted to cover the Bundesliga, and was that sort of the decision, or was just an interest in German culture? And then secondly, in terms of commentating on a number of different leagues and from players all over the world, in terms of getting the accent right and pronouncing it, and do you change that? Because do you think in your mind, well, I'm broadcasting to an international audience, should I not sort of say this correctly in a sort of German accent? Or so what's that process like?
Well, the first question, I had an interest in German from a very young age. And I mentioned earlier, the 74 World Cup in West Germany was a pretty special time for me as a young lad in Aberdeen. And I remember just being obsessed with Germany. And of course, you had West and East Germany both competing in that World Cup. And I remember just pestering my parents, morning, noon, and night with questions about Germany. And they finally had to get an encyclopedia to help me, because in those days, of course, we didn't have internet. It was a different era. But I was really fascinated with everything about Germany. A couple of years later, so around 9 in primary school in Scotland, that's when we begin to learn languages. And it's pot luck. You're either, well, at least in those days it was, you're either in the French class or in the German class. Luckily, I was in the German class. As it turned out, I could have switched. If I'd been in the French class, I could have made a special request to move to the German class. But I was in the German class anyway, which was brilliant. And I realized, for whatever reason, that I had an ability to learn German. I'm not going to say it came easily to me, but I enjoyed it. I really liked it. And I found that I picked it up quickly, and I liked the kind of the taxing aspect of it, because it is arguably the most difficult European language to learn. I didn't know that at the time, but it is very taxing and challenging if you want to get things like grammatical structure correct. You could learn a more basic version of German, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to know everything with with the exact nature of the grammar in my head. And the other thing that sort of happened around that time was I began to play around with radio. And because of my location, our family's location on the North Sea coast in Aberdeen, I realized that we had access to radio stations from around Europe. Because if you can picture or have a look on the map, you can see, Aberdeen just across the water from Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Germany, just further down the North Sea. And radio signals travel quite a long distance, especially at night, when you have just the flat sea, basically, as the sort of the transmission field. And so I began to realize that I could listen to German radio every day. And that became my sort of background a lot of the time. I would, sit and do my German work, and I'd have German radio on. And a lot of it was music, but chat, news, sport. And then I realized that I could listen to the Bundesliga, that the Bundesliga Conference, as they called it, was on there. So, somebody who was studying German, I thought, this is great, and somebody who was a football fanatic, I began to listen to this. And yeah, of course, my friends thought I was nuts. They were saying, what are you doing sitting listening to a foreign language and listening to people, they would come to the house and they'd go, how can you understand any of that? And I'd say, well, I'm learning German, And of course, this helped my German, no doubt about it, because I went the extra mile. And again, that's what I say to young people. If you have a passion for something, go the extra mile, Don't just, follow the crowd. Do your own thing and really try to make yourself excellent at something rather than just sort of good. If you have that passion, if it's something you really like, then try and be great at it. So this has stayed with me, and it's really only in the latter part of my career that I've been able to use German to the extent that I do now. I mean, in the early days, it was useful when I was at the BBC. And again, this was pre-internet and at a time when not everybody spoke English. I was always charged with calling FIFA and UEFA because they said, you'll be able to talk to them in their language and you'll get information that we might not get in English, that they might be a bit more guarded. And that was definitely the way I operated. And the same with the World Cup in '94. That was one of the reasons why I got hired for that job, was that I had a languages background, and they said, we want that. We want the fact that that you bring this to the table. But obviously, in more recent years, with my more intimate connection with the Bundesliga and being in Germany a lot more, then it has undoubtedly paid dividends. Now, the second part of your question about pronunciations, I've just always felt, and again, this probably comes down to the fact that I have a languages background, I've always felt that if I can pronounce a name 100% accurately, then I should do that. Why should I dumb that down? If I can say Thomas Müller, why would I say Thomas Müller? If I can say Michael Ballack, why wouldn't I say that? Why would I say Michael Ballack? Because one is actually his name, the other is an approximation of his name. And I realize not everybody goes along with me on this. A lot of people think, oh no, you should anglicize everything. You should maybe dumb it down a little bit. I just believe it's respect. And if I'm capable of saying a name, why would I reduce my ability to do that on air when in fact I can actually say the name properly? Again, I know that it's not easy for everybody to make some of these subtle sounds in languages. I know not everybody is a linguist, and I'm not necessarily asking for that. But I think if we have a skill in life, I think we should be able to display that skill. It'd be like saying to a central midfield player who can pass who can do something with the ball that maybe his teammates can't. Maybe he has deficiencies in other areas, but he can do a certain thing. You wouldn't say, well, don't do that. Oh, sorry, my microphone just going the wrong direction there. I'm getting too excited here. Don't do that. Don't do that, because that will upset the other people who can't do that. You wouldn't, would you? So that's really where I come from on that. And I am a stickler for it. I admit that. I go to the nth degree with it because it's important to me. And especially when I was in Scotland, when I was working in Scotland, I would make a point of approaching every new player to the league who came from a different country or culture. And I would introduce myself, and I would always say, can you just say your name in your language or the way you say it, not the anglicized version. You tell me how you say the name. And I had a number of occasions where these players would then approach me the next time I would turn up at their ground and say, thank you very much for doing that. My parents were watching the game, and it was so nice. It was so nice for them to hear our name said properly. Because there is a tendency, I have to say, especially in the UK culture, there was a tendency to change names beyond recognition so that they're not even really close to what the origin name is. And as I say, I'm not asking for everybody to do this. Everybody views the job of commentary in his or her own way. What I would say is that I do wish that we would adhere to the basic phonetics of a sound. I realize not everybody can say or u, and easily, and have it roll off the tongue. But there are times when names just get changed and syllables get missed out, and before you know it, the name sounds very, very different. And and then those of us who actually do speak a language get accused of being the ones who are butchering the names when we're going the extra mile to try to get it right. So that is a small beef that I have. But I mean, as I say, I can't control anyone else. And I take the view very firmly. All I can do is control myself and set my own standards. And if somebody wants to take issue with that, then, let them do it.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about a UK culture that struggled with the Jose versus Jose Mourinho for nearly 20 years. So asking them to put extra effort into other names might be tough. Just before Frank asks his question, though, I'd be interested to know, has there been one name that you've really struggled with or found difficult, or is there a particular sort of nationality or language where you find it very hard to kind of get used to those pronunciations?
I'm trying to think. Some of the I'm trying to think of an example of one that does need. I mean, there are some names that need a little bit of thought more than others. And I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. I know the one that I never had a problem with this one, but I know the one years ago that used to really trouble British commentators was Olarticochea. Olarticochea. I never had a problem because in Scotland we make that R sound. And so I find it's often with people in the UK, English commentators especially, it's the R sound because they don't really make the R too well. So the R is like an R rather than an R, So, but I'm trying to think of one.
I know I've put you on the spot there.
Yeah, I can't think of one off the top of my head that has made me, but there have been some, obviously. But then what you do is then you just take your time and you study. I really do wish I could come up with one off the top of my head, but I can't. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I know I put you on the spot, so.
So kind of going along with that part of being able to pronounce every name correctly, I assume there has to be a lot of preparation in knowing everyone that's going to be on the pitch, especially when you're freelancing and you're going maybe not even from one team to another within a league, but you're going from completely one league to another league, where you have 20 teams plus in each league. How difficult is that aspect to remember everyone's name and remember everyone who's on the pitch so that you don't, like, are you constantly looking down and confirming that that's the person that you're seeing on the pitch, or do you have like a cheat sheet the day before you're going through all the names to make sure you don't forget when it becomes match day? How do you prepare for being able to know everyone that's going to be out there?
I think the preparation is something that we all do in our own way. And what you've just outlined is part of the preparation. We could look at notes which have factual pieces of information, data, but preparation is also identification. In fact, it's the most basic aspect of preparation. And that's always the first question I ask myself before I tackle a game is, can I identify them? First of all, do I recognize them all? Without numbers, would I recognize them if they were just walking around on the pitch? And to be honest, I do that. I test myself always when the players begin to walk out, even before they're actually in warm-up mode, when they're just wearing their normal street clothes, so to speak. I always, as the camera sort of bounces from player to player, I just make sure I know who they all are. And if there's one that I'm doubtful about, then I'll double check at that point, because sometimes you have a couple of players who maybe look a little bit similar haircuts, things like that. But the preparation is certainly intense when it comes to that kind of thing, and it's just something you kind of do. For example, as I speak to you now, I'm getting ready for a Bundesliga game on Friday. The preparation is not complete, but some of it is done, and it's just as you go, things are being implanted in your memory bank, and that's how you do it. Obviously, with teams that you cover a lot, it's fairly easy. I happen to do Bayern quite a lot, so I don't really need much of a sort of a refresher when it comes to Bayern, because I see them all the time, and I know all their players and I know what numbers they wear. And I'm doing Hertha, who I haven't done for a little while, so that will take a little bit more preparation, but I watch them often enough, so it's not a huge problem. If it's two teams who you don't see a lot, then you need to do a bit of extra on that and keep. And I'm always testing myself. I always just randomly will pull up a player on Google and images of that player, and just make sure that I have in my head, right, okay, what are his features? Or you prepare yourself for maybe two different looks that player has. Maybe he changed his hair 2 months ago, and maybe he's going to change it again. All these little things go through your mind. But then the other thing that I do on match days, and I know other commentators do this, maybe not every commentator, but I always, when the players are actually in warm-up mode, I then go through them all again, and I look at the boot colors that they're wearing. So that, if there are two players who do look alike, and I know, okay, he's yellow today, he is white today in terms of his boot colors, then I'll make a note of that. And that can actually be very handy, because remember, we have to make a quick call a lot of the time, say at a set piece. The commentator's worst nightmare is a set piece goal in the first few seconds of a game when there's no real rhythm, and maybe it's a crowd of 5 different players, and you see one head go up and you think he got a touch on it, but you maybe don't see the number, but maybe you saw the boot color. That is sometimes our way of differentiating. So all these kind of different techniques, but yeah, knowing what they look like, being able to identify, same with, pronunciations, as we mentioned, having that all in your head so that when the game comes around, you're not really looking at the sheet. As I say, that's there for reference. And if I ever need to go there in an emergency, I can. But generally, I look at my sheets right before the game, halftime, and not much else. because hopefully it's all in the head. Hopefully.
And I guess some of the challenge too, and this is a touch a little bit about maybe how you've adapted to sort of commentating during the pandemic. How much harder is that when you are watching on a screen versus being there in sort of in stadium and being able to see more of the pitch and get a better sense of sort of where different players are? How much more challenging is it to commentate from just watching a feed? And then in the current circumstances, are you in a studio? Are you doing it from home? And then the feed you get, is it just the same sort of one feed that everyone is seeing on their home, or are you getting sort of additional sort of shots that a producer is providing for you?
There are a few layers to that question, so I'll answer that one as best I can. You'd obviously prefer to be at the stadium. I think you can always do a better job from a stadium than you can off tube. But I would say that I've been quite lucky because large slices of my career have involved games off tube. And there are some commentators who haven't worked off tube very much at all. And I think if you have worked off tube, it actually does help you as a commentator. It gives you a kind of a sixth sense as to what might be happening off the ball. It forces you to really, zone in on techniques that I mentioned earlier, like boot colors, like other ways of identifying, because you just have this one view for the most part. What I would say, though, is there are times when I've done a game off the monitor and I felt that maybe I was actually better positioned to commentate on it than had I been at the stadium. And I say that because sometimes when you're in a stadium or a particular stadium, the view is terrible. Sometimes you are, I think about the Maracanã in Brazil, in Rio, 2014 World Cup. That was a horrendous view. And, and when I say a horrendous view, it was miles from the pitch and it was really high up. And you felt as though you were, 2-3 miles away from the action. So when you're in that situation, okay, you can see the wide and the high picture in front of you, but you struggle to identify players, and even the boot colors in that kind of situation from that far away, gold might look a little bit like red. It's not as easy to pick that out. And so that can be problematic. Whereas if you're actually just watching and just focused on the one picture, then it is easier to pick out players. So that's where it can get a little bit complicated. But broadly speaking, you would rather be at the venue than commentating from a TV monitor. Now, in terms of the Bundesliga, normally, if we were doing a game off monitor, which does happen from time to time for the world feed, then we would have more than just the one feed. We have a second camera that we call camera one that shows things happening off the ball. It's the wider shot, really. And that's handy because you then see, for example, if the ball took a couple of deflections on the way through and both players are appealing, one saying it's a corner, the other saying it's a goal kick. Sometimes with the main feed, they'll go straight to a replay and you actually don't know, if you're working off monitor, what's been given. You don't know for sure. But if you have the second feed, you can see the referee has pointed over to the corner, the corner taker is jogging over to take it, and it's a corner. So that can be helpful. With regard to what's happening at the moment, I had a very frustrating period the first few months of the pandemic, but I just got on with life and tried to make my own content online. And I did have some other projects to work on as well. But I was probably in the most, frustrated position of most commentators because I, lived so far from the action of my bread and butter, and so I couldn't commentate on the Bundesliga for the period when it came back after the initial phase of the pandemic, and similarly at the start of this season, except for when ESPN had me do the big live games, only a handful, but on linear TV in the US. But now we have the technology, and it's taken a while to develop it, but we now have a technology that means I can commentate from here, from my home. And it's amazing technology, actually. So it means that the game feed comes up on my screen. I am linked with the main studio in Cologne, in Germany. I'm linked up also with my co-commentator, who could be anywhere, could be in Germany, could be somewhere else. And it's just really as normal. I have a producer in my ear the way I would if I were doing a game. And it's remarkable how well that has gone, I think. So that may well be the future, that may well be the future for a lot of commentators. And I remember in the 90s, sound engineers telling me that this was going to be the future, that, in a couple of years' time, you won't, always have to go to the venue or even to a studio. You'll be able to do it all from home. And it has taken an emergency, a global emergency for this to actually sprout wings, if you like. But necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. So that's really where that that gives you a sort of an insight into how we do it. But yeah, it's going to be a lot longer, I think, in this mode. I haven't had to be in a studio apart from when I was at ESPN back in September, and then again in November for a couple of games. Other than that, I honestly have hardly left my house except to go for a walk. So very grateful for the fact that I can do as much as I can from home.
Must be an interesting new challenge. And I know I don't want to, kind of in the end, I suppose we don't want to keep you for too long. I would be interested to know, at the midway point now in the Bundesliga season, and maybe not the most exciting season in the sense that it looks as if Bayern Munich are headed towards winning the title. And even at the bottom, it looks fairly, the bottom two look as if they're almost certain to go down. The European places are up for grabs. How do you feel the season has gone so far? Is there anything that's really surprised you on that front?
Well, I think it was very exciting at the top until 2 or 3 weeks ago. I think we were at the stage where we thought this could really go any which way, and Bayern were looking a bit wobbly and conceding goals. They had, 11 games in a row without a clean sheet. And I think other teams sensed they could get at the Bayern defense. But just in the last few weeks, we've seen the other contenders, if you like, all stumble, to one degree or another. I mean, Leipzig have looked like the team most likely to make any sort of run, but then they fell at Mainz just a couple of match days ago. And I think probably the gap realistically is too big. And apart from Leipzig, I don't see anybody else in a position to make a challenge. So that is a bit disappointing. But of course, there are still stories in terms of who's going to be second, who's going to be in the Champions League. And you have challenges from the likes of Eintracht Frankfurt, who are on this amazing winning run at the moment, power charged by Andre Silva, their main striker. You have Union, who, again, I had probably down near the relegation zone this season in their second Bundesliga campaign, but with know-how, with good coaching, with strong recruitment, they've been able to really do a lot more than most people would have expected. Wolfsburg, another team who might find themselves in the top four. You never know, between Gladbach and Dortmund and Leverkusen. So it's very sort of jam-packed in that sector of the table, with the exception that, of course, Bayern are opening up a significant gap now. At the other ends, I think it's going to be difficult for Mainz and Schalke. We could probably do a whole podcast on Schalke's fall and some of the unfortunate things that have happened to that great club. But they do look destined for the second division, the Zweite Bundesliga. There is the matter of who finishes 16th, goes into the relegation playoff. And, I don't think you'll mind if I say I hope that's not Köln, but they got a very good win against Bielefeld, much needed one yesterday to lift themselves up. So we shall see. But I think the thing about any league is, if you're invested in the league as a fan, as a commentator, there are always stories there. And the Bundesliga is no exception.
Great.
Do you think oh, go ahead, Frank.
Go ahead, Eddie. You can go.
No, I know you have a question lined up, so go for it.
No, actually, I was gonna, because I know we're running out of time, and I think a lot of our listeners would hate if we skipped over this part. Announcing in FIFA, how did that come about, and what is it like to have to record to be in FIFA? What was that experience like?
Well, it came about really by chance in the late autumn of 2017. I had just moved back to the USA. I'd been, I think, as we mentioned earlier, I'd been back in the UK for almost a decade, and my wife and I decided it was time to come back to the Boston area for family reasons, for other reasons too. I realized that as a freelance, I could do a lot of what I enjoyed, still being based here. And out of the blue, I got this email from a third party saying that they were associated with a well-known video game, didn't say which one it was, and that there was an interest in this video game company talking to me. And this sort of went on for a few days. It was all a little bit kind of secretive. And then it emerged that it was indeed the big one, FIFA, EA Sports FIFA. And at that point, they just wanted to know of my interest and could we sort of arrange a time to meet. That took a few weeks to kind of get over the line. But I flew to Vancouver to meet them and loved the team. They were great people. Could see how dedicated, how passionate they were. And as I say, they wanted me to be part of the game. And again, to give context, at that point, I had, I suppose, maybe been best known around the world for my Champions League work on ESPN. And it so happened that the Champions League was being added to EA Sports FIFA for the upcoming edition. That would have been FIFA 19. So that was really where we started, was with the Champions League and the Europa League. But I had to make sure I didn't tell too many people about it at that time, because it wasn't going to be announced until June of the following year. So we were going to start recording, but I had to, even to sort of close friends, when they would say, "Well, what are you doing in the studio this week?" "Oh, yeah, just a project, something. I'll tell you about it in time," kind of thing. And so nobody knew, apart from my wife and a few very close family people. It was great fun, and it is great fun. I mean, I always say to people, a FIFA day for me means a smile on my face when I go in, a smile on my face when I come out. I work with a terrific production team. They have tremendous attention to detail, and that is part of what I enjoy about it, is the exact nature of what we're doing. I mean, where it differs, I would say, from normal commentary is when you're doing live commentary, you're reacting, you're doing it, and when it's done, it's done. Obviously, with a video game, you want to be more exact about everything, because it all has to join up with other things that are on the game. So in other words, something that I said in, recorded in, say, February 2019 has to join up seamlessly with something I might have said 18 months later or recorded. You know what I mean? So things get joined all the time in the game. And so that's part of the fun of it, is thinking through all these different joins and edits in your head, and what might work and what might not work so well. But it's collaborative, with the producer, with the sound man, with Andrew and Pete, who are the stalwarts on the project that way. And as I say, we work together to try to come up with solutions to make it as good as possible. There are long days doing it, but great fun days. And as I've said on a few other interviews, the last few years, it's been around 25 days in a studio for each FIFA edition. That's not 25 consecutively. We've spread it around the year a little bit. But it's great fun. It's challenging, but in a very good way. I absolutely love my association with FIFA.
And did they give you a
awesome.
script, or do you?
That's exactly what I was going to ask. Do they give you like clips of a match or something? Like, how does that work?
I get that question a lot. It's not a script as such. It's more a concept. So because obviously they want it to sound like me as well. But of course, the one thing is that there are only really so many ways you can depict something, without sort of stretching the bounds of credibility. So we work together, and what they will say to me is, okay, the situation here is, a player is, a midfield player is threading a through ball through for the attacking player to run onto. Derek, can you come up with, 15 ways of how you might say that in normal commentary? And so that is the challenge that we have. And as I say, it forces you to think in a different way about how you're conveying information. And so that's how it is, really. I mean, obviously, when it comes to scripting, yeah, I mean, names are on a script, but, there are certain names that I'm simply calling in different ways, so that's with a lower intensity, and then with a higher one. And that, obviously takes a certain discipline as well, because they all, again, have to fit with the rest of the game. So that if some names I do are louder than others, that's not going to sound so great as well. But great respect for everybody who's associated with that game, because there are thousands around the world in different offices of EA Sports, who all have their own jobs to do in making sure that the game is the game that people around the world play and love so much.
And at the moment in the game, you commentate along with Lee Dixon. I assume this may have been different for this version of the game in the pandemic, but typically, do you go into studio together to try and, because obviously for some of it where you're sort of playing off each other, or again, are those individual clips that they just merge?
Well, as far as possible, we like to be together, but it's not always possible. And obviously, in a pandemic year, it's not been possible. So, again, I'm very grateful for the fact that I've been able to set up my own studio here at home. We found the very best room next door. It's actually normally my clothes storage cupboard, but it has the best audio. When we did the test of it later, ahead of the sessions, Pete, my audio man, said, "That's the room that you want to use. That's brilliant." And so we have it all, we have it all, what's the best words to use? Sort of dried out, maybe would be the best audio expression, so that the audio is as dry as possible. And that's where I do my stuff, and Lee did his contributions separately for the most recent game. And again, that's how people have to work in a pandemic. We're not alone in that. Everybody else is going through things like that. And, there are some things, I think we find this in life generally, and I'm sure this will be the case whenever we get to a post-pandemic stage. There are things we have learned during the pandemic that maybe we should have learned before, that we can put into our lives, and actually, whether it's being more efficient, whether it's saving the planet, all these things together, I think, add up to our experience as human beings. And that's why I'm a bit uneasy, without going off topic too much. I'm a bit uneasy when people say, "I just want to get back to normal." I always sort of say, well, yeah, there are elements of that, of course, but I want us to get to better. I want us to take our experience from the last year, and probably a lot longer, to be honest, and put that to good use, and make the world better. What can we do to try to achieve that?
No, it is really interesting to have this opportunity to sort of, not everything's a negative, and to kind of see what we can learn and take forward and improve things. I guess one final question from me, and I'll stick a little bit on the FIFA topic.
Sure.
Do you ever play the game?
You wouldn't want to see me playing the game. I'm not very good at it. I'm not brilliant at all, but I do occasionally try my luck at it. I'm more likely to, in actual fact, watch other people playing it. And I do that. I'll sometimes spend an hour just watching other people play it. People say, "Well, why do you want to do that?" And I'll say, "Well, I want to see what good players are doing with the game. But most particularly, I want to see how the commentary works out on the game, so that I can make little notes to myself. And also, when it comes to our discussions with the production team, little things that I think, yeah, okay, maybe that doesn't work as well, or maybe that works really well, or maybe I could say this a bit differently, all things like that, all from the point of view of just trying to improve as we go along. But yeah, I find it's better to watch people who really know what they're doing playing the game, than to try to analyze it based on my novice efforts.
Great. Yeah. So thanks so much for joining us. And I guess my last question would be, in the beginning of the interview, you said when football was first coming to America, the Americans were kind of trying to put their spin on it. And what obviously comes to mind for me is the penalty run-ups. What did you think of those? And is there any chance those are coming back?
Oh, do you mean the old 35-yard shootout things that we used to see in the NASL and then MLS? Yeah. Well, I have to say I was not a fan of them. I did cover them in my early days broadcasting MLS in the 90s, and no, I was not a fan. I think what we have to remember too is I've seen this sort of crop up. People saying, "Oh, this is far better than penalty shootouts," and I'll say, well, remember, they weren't to replace penalty shootouts. They were there because people didn't like drawn matches. That was the reason why they came in. It wasn't to replace a penalty shootout. It was because the organizers of the American League back in the NASL days decided that draws were not an American concept. And MLS carried this into its early years, but there's a good reason why they got rid of them. Because, imagine you're having this, how many draws are there in an average week? Maybe a third of the games. You're having it for a third of the games every week for no good reason at all, when a draw is a perfectly valid result. So, no, I have to admit, was very happy when the day arrived when we didn't have to cover those shootouts anymore. Just my honest opinion.
That's funny.
We'll have to see if you change your tune if they bring them back.
I don't think they're going to bring them back, but that's just my view.
Well, Derek, thank you very much. It's been really interesting speaking to you about your career and sort of everything else. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Eddie, Frank, thank you very much for having me. It's been most enjoyable.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.